apartment for America. The Expressway Inn and Suites, where a good night's rest costs less. And the Peacock Alley. It's time to get started. Another hour of the Legislature Today is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dale Wetzel. This is the Legislature Today radio program. We're coming to you from the Peacock Alley American Bar and Grill in downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. This hour is sponsored by the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas. We're going to be speaking about credit union issues and cooperatives in our second hour of the Legislature Today radio program. First of all, I thought we'd get into a bit of what happened at the Legislature today. The biggest story was the North Dakota Senate approved a bill that would expand Medicaid coverage to approximately at least 20,000 people in North Dakota, maybe as many as 32,000 people. These will be people that Medicaid does not, for which people are not eligible. It'll cover people who aren't eligible for Medicaid presently. Particularly, we're talking about single people who have no children and who make $16,000 a year or less. These folks will be eligible for Medicaid coverage. And the North Dakota Senate approved that idea today. That now goes to the governor, Jack Dalrymple, for his signature. The governor included this provision in his executive budget recommendations. The bill includes a 4-year sunset clause, meaning that the legislature in 2017 will be revisiting this subject. It also includes some cautionary language that will be told to people who enroll in the program that their benefits could be lifted if federal support for the Medicaid expansion is either reduced or eliminated. The attractiveness for this for state legislators is that the federal government will pay the full price for covering these new folks in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And after that, the share of the federal price paying, the share that the federal government will pick up of this expansion will decrease gradually to 90%
okay, Greg, can you
by
hear me
2020. And if that, once 2020 arrives, it'll be 90%. The federal government will pay, at least this is what the law says now, for forever, at least, forever is a long time, but there are no plans, at least in the present federal law, to decrease the state share of this program above 10%. This is part of the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare law that was approved, and as a result, a number of the Republican legislators in particular were not that pleased with the idea of approving this, but some of them, even the coalition of the reluctant, decided that North Dakotans are paying taxes to support this program that are going into effect this year and next gradually, and that if North Dakotans are going to be paying taxes to support this expansion of Medicaid, they might as well benefit from it. There was also a bill in the House today that deals with the territorial question of what water it deals with rural water districts and which customers they will serve if a nearby city expands into territory that they presently serve. There was a rather lengthy debate, a verbal brawl, if you will, in the House about whether or not this legislation should go to conference committee, which will mean that a group of senators and House members, 3 senators and 3 House members to be exact, will work out the final details of this bill. There was a faction that did not want this bill to go to conference committee and a faction that did, and the faction that did carried the day quite handily. So we're going to see some additional work on this bill, some additional debate. There is some concern among rural water districts as to how their operations will be affected if a city moves into their territory, and also there's some question about whether this legislation is necessary because there are present agreements between rural water districts and cities if the cities expand into rural water district territory. The last thing I was going to mention is that a proposed constitutional amendment that is an example of how the legislature can change things as it moves through the sausage factory was defeated today. What this amendment did was it put on the Attorney General the decision of whether or not to allow particular initiated measures on the ballot. These would be initiated measures that affect the state budget. What the amendment said is if the Constitution, a constitutional amendment, an initiated measure to amend the Constitution would affect the state budget, that if the Attorney General made that determination, then the Attorney General would keep that particular constitutional amendment off the ballot. Now, this would have affected the situation last year where there was a constitutional amendment to abolish property taxes. Under this amendment, if it had been in place at the time, that amendment to abolish property taxes would not have been allowed to even be circulated, much less be put on the ballot. The way this started out is rather interesting, because the way it started out was it gave the legislature veto power over any ballot measure that had a budget effect of more than $40 million over 2 years. That is how it started out. It ended up as something completely different, and in any case, the completely different thing failed, and so it's not something that we need to worry about presently. We have with us on the Credit Union of the Association of the Dakotas hour this evening, we have Mr. Robbie Thompson, who is the president of the association. We also have on the telephone Mr. Greg McKee, I should say. He is the director of the Quentin Burdick Center for Cooperatives and an associate professor in the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics at North Dakota State University. First of all, we'll start with Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, please tell us, first of all, credit unions are cooperatives. What does that mean?
That is correct. Credit unions are a form of cooperative. Multiple different cooperatives are out there, but credit unions are a financial cooperative. What that really means is that they are a democratically controlled institution. They have a volunteer board of directors that oversee the organization. One member, one vote structure. And as a cooperative, they run under the cooperative principles. They are voluntary and open membership, democratically controlled institutions.
And what is the advantage of this kind of organizational structure, sir?
Well, the advantage of being a member of a credit union is generally we do have lower rates on our loans, lower fees, better rates on our deposit products. But you get to become an owner of the institution. You're not just a customer. You're not just somebody that they count that walks into the door. Your money isn't being used to make a profit for a small number of shareholders. It is being used to return all of that profit back to the members of the credit union. Each person participates in the credit union by making deposits, borrowing funds, and each person benefits from that. That's a member of the cooperative.
We have with us. I was mistaken earlier. I mentioned that we had someone on the phone. We actually have someone else on the phone. His name is Mike Bell. He's the president of the National Cooperative Business Association in Washington, D.C. Mr. Bell, can you tell us what the National Cooperative Business Association does?
Well, it's a good question. We are the organization that actually tries to link all the types of cooperatives and to make sure that folks on Capitol Hill understand the ownership structure that Robbie just talked about. So really trying to link finance and credit unions, agriculture, rural electric cooperatives, rural telephone cooperatives, also worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, food co-ops that are doing great work around getting nutrition to folks. So we're the organization that tries to make sure that members of Congress get that this business model is about Main Street and not about Wall Street or big business.
How is a cooperative business organization different from, say, a limited partnership or a corporation or a limited liability company?
Yeah, I think one of the main pieces to this, and obviously those forms of organizations are fine organizations, but their sole purpose is to drive profits back to usually a small group of owners and to maximize those profits. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think in our country in the last 10 years, we've seen some pretty egregious examples of making profits so high that it's not about putting money back into the business to keep it going and to providing good jobs in some cases. The cooperatives really are there to be sure that no matter what the product line is that folks, one, have control over it, and two, that there's good and fair pricing to it so that folks can afford it. In the credit union example that we just talked about a little bit, it is making sure that folks have access to credit that's affordable, and again, doing it in a situation where those profits are shared by each person with an account, as opposed to a small group of people that own a bank. That's the comparison.
You mentioned that one of your tasks as the president of the National Cooperative Business Association is to make sure that members of Congress understand what cooperatives are. Is that a task that needs much work? I mean, do you have a good number of members of Congress who don't deal with cooperatives and are not familiar with them?
Well, I think what we find generally is that depending on where you are, I mean, North Dakota, you guys are a particularly good state for having a broad number of co-ops. For instance, electricity. You guys are well covered by electric co-ops. California, for instance, is a state that has very few examples of electric co-ops. So, you know, what we try to make sure is that we're actually connecting all of these together. And when people see credit unions, for instance, that they know that they're a cooperative, and that folks then put that in context to the agriculture, the farmers co-op that they know of. CHS is a great example of a farmers co-op. But I think our job isn't that we find folks are anti-co-op in every way, but they don't always think about the business model and making sure that the alternative of having a cooperative in any given type of business is protected, and that we've got good laws and regs that actually promote the cooperative development.
One of the reservations that one hears about cooperatives particularly from, I should say, conservative folks, is that cooperatives appear kind of almost as quasi-socialist institutions. Do you run into that very often?
Well, I think that you know, if folks see it that way, that you know, cooperatives, I think are a particularly American institution, and rather than seen as socialist, I think it's definitely a sense of being seen as being able to say that they're closest to the folks that own them and that choose to go this route. I look at this as really an issue of consumer choice. And where we've got choices to, you know, to bank at a bank, for instance, or go with a credit union, that's good old American fair consumer choice in our view.
Sir, is it more difficult to organize a cooperative than it is to, say, for example, start a corporation or a limited liability company?
Well, yeah, I think there is the hurdle of getting folks organized to do business this way. And not everybody now knows how to start one. A lot of the more famous cooperatives that your listeners probably would be aware of probably started in the 30s and 40s. But we do find lots of folks are using the business model now when they understand it to be able to work together. And workers' co-ops are where that's happening in a lot of cases. So we're seeing instances where domestic workers are forming small co-ops to go in and do contracts with businesses to clean offices and to clean homes. That's a great way for you know, a dozen workers to come together and go the route of cooperative. What we're also seeing is a lot of baby boomers getting ready to retire and trying to figure out what they're going to do with their business. And in this economic environment across the country, in some instances, not finding it easy to sell the business for what they want, and they're able to look at selling to their employees into a worker co-op so that the business goes on, and the folks that have been doing the work for the small business and organization can keep it going. And 3 out of 5 jobs are formed by small business in this country, so cooperatives are a big part of keeping those small business jobs growing.
We're speaking to Mike Bell. He's the president of the National Cooperative Business Association in Washington, D.C. Mr. Bell, what sort of cooperatives are ascendant these days? In North Dakota, for example, we have electric co-ops, we have telephone co-ops, we have a number of cooperatives, and one of the ones that is becoming more popular in North Dakota are food co-ops, co-ops organized to purchase certain types of maybe organic foods, raw milk, that sort of thing. What sort of cooperatives in the country are gaining popularity more than others?
Well, and what we're seeing is I think the 2008 economic crash has put even more emphasis on cooperatives in almost every sector. Credit unions in the U.S. now represent $1 trillion of consumer savings. That is a lot of folks' money put into savings accounts, as well as getting ready to cross the 100 million members, about 1 in 3 Americans. So I know those numbers are also ascendant in North Dakota. We are seeing, as you point out, food cooperatives are really expanding because folks do want opportunities to have a food store closer to them. And we've seen supermarkets pull out of smaller communities. So a lot of times what we're seeing is new food co-ops are springing up to take the place of organizations, for-profit organizations that have decided to pull out because they see a very low margin on the business. Those are two ones that you see. 75% of the people in the country geographically, or the geographic space in the country, are covered by an electric cooperative. So, in every sector you go to, I think you're seeing, a number of ways that folks are covered. And I'll give you a new example that you may not have thought of. But if you Google the Freelancers Union, that's an organization, a cooperative that's being a mutually owned organization that represents folks that are actually doing freelance work. Because we're seeing more folks doing consulting type work and not the typical 40-hour week. 200,000 folks belong to that new mutual type of organization, and they're getting health insurance, they're getting benefits out of it, and then access to opportunities through the networking system of helping share piecemeal work, whether it's in writing or graphic design or computer programming. So there's high-tech cooperative growth that's going on right now as well.
Sir, the way a corporation raises capital or equity is it sells shares to the public. How does a cooperative raise equity, and how difficult can that be at times?
That's a good question. Cooperatives are typically putting earnings back into their own businesses. So that's one way they're doing it. They're also accessing equity in the marketplace. So they're going out to their own members sometimes to seek investment, and sometimes that's often done at very good returns. We're seeing debentures by food co-ops where, in order to raise capital, they're paying 3 and 4% on the debentures in order to get that type of investment. So cooperatives have to be creative in the marketplace in order to get investment in these more difficult times, but they can also borrow, and they're doing that as well, and rates have been good in that form. So you're seeing growth through the process of reaching out through borrowing as well.
Mr. Bell, are cooperatives regulated any differently than, say, a corporation or a limited liability company because of their ownership structure and the fact that they're owned by their members?
Generally, no. They're usually regulated in the same way that that their brethren are in that type of industry. So, Robbie's on the line and can tell you that credit unions are regulated every bit as strenuously as banks, and frankly have to do it sometimes with fewer staff because they're smaller. But in every industry that you're working, whether it's the electrical field or food co-ops in the food sector, they are meeting all the requirements that any type of business in that line of business would have to comply with.
Mr. Bell, do you think that sort of regulatory equivalence is even appropriate, given that that cooperatives are member-owned rather than shareholder-owned?
Well, you know what? I don't think we necessarily think that we shouldn't comply the same as other businesses, but I certainly do think that sometimes the scale and the scope of it ought to be looked at. And I'm going to give you the perspective. I think at credit unions is this whole economic mess. We didn't cause it. Credit unions didn't cause it. But I can tell you the burden that's been placed back has been placed back on all financial institutions equally. So where Wall Street banks went out and did all the wrong things, credit unions like the ones in North Dakota were not doing that kind of lending and have had to suffer along with everybody else. So I think the argument is we're not afraid to comply with the same types of laws, but we think that if a group of institutions has created a problem, they're the ones that ought to be punished, and not everyone with the same brush.
We've been speaking to Mr. Mike Bell. He's the president of the National Cooperative Business Association of Washington, D.C. It's a trade organization. We also have with us Mr. Robbie Thompson, who is the president of the Credit Union Association of the Dakotas, which is a trade group that represents credit unions in North Dakota and South Dakota. We're going to be back in a moment with another gentleman who's going to be talking about cooperatives. His name is Greg McKee, I should say. He is the director of the Quentin Burdick Center for Cooperatives and the associate professor in the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics on the North Dakota State University campus. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Bell.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with Mr. Greg McKee.
The legislature